My name is Jennifer Gray Thompson, and I am the CEO of After the Fire. Welcome to the podcast, How to Disaster: Recover, Rebuild, and Reimagine. In this podcast, we bring you the very best practices, best hearts, and great ideas from other disaster-affected communities. Thank you for joining us. Another episode of the How to Disaster podcast, where we help you recover, rebuild, and reimagine. Today, our guest is Katherine Hammack, and she's the Director of Special Projects at the Green Business Certification, Inc., or GBCI. GBCI is the premier organization for independent review and credentialing of green business industry performance and practice standards. In short, they help monitor and assign LEED and peer certification to professional groups and individuals that demonstrate sustainable building practices, green building, and quality improvement. It's an important area to understand as new homes are being built to better standards, and that includes rebuilding after a fire. We're really happy to have Katherine on the show today to actually help educate our audience and this host in what role does GBCI, I can never say that, play a role in rebuilding, and how communities can better prepare for natural disasters. Something that most people don't know is that we actually spend about 6 times as much responding to a disaster after the fact than we do in funds for resiliency. In other words, if you spend $1 on the front end, you actually save another $5 on the back end. This is one of the reasons why we wanted Katherine on the show today, so she can help educate both the audience and me on the role that they play and how we can actually build back better in a way that doesn't make people who've lost everything have to incur much higher costs, but at the same time pays attention to the needs around climate change. So thank you so much for joining us. And once again, I'm so happy to have Katherine on the show. Once again, welcome to the podcast. I'm so happy to have you today. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself and also your organization?
Certainly. My name's Katherine Hammack, and I am with GBCI, which is the Green Building Certification Incorporated, part of the U.S. Green Building Council. And our mission is really to try and make the world a better place. And we do that through several means. The main is LEED, Leadership in Energy and Environmental Design, which many have heard about, I'm sure. But that really is how to build and design a sustainable building, a building that is good for the people who occupy it, and it's good for the environment, and it uses less water and less energy. And really, LEED is a menu of a lot of different things you can do. And depending upon how many of those best practices you implement, your building gets a rating, whether it's certified or silver, gold. And of course, the pinnacle is platinum. And if you get a platinum rating, that means you're really focused on sustainability in the built environment. And so after LEED was developed almost 30 years ago now, we came up with other programs at the request of customers to cover things that LEED did not. And one of those programs I'm focused on that we're going to talk about today is called PEER. And that's Performance Excellence in Electricity Renewal. Sorry.
No, don't be sorry. Acronyms are hard. And one of the things I love about doing this podcast is that we don't expect anybody to know coming into this. And so it's okay. Like, just, yeah, it's all good. I appreciate your...
And you know, I call it PEER all the time, and I very rarely define it. So I think it's important to define it, and defining that a sustainable power grid is important to sustainable buildings. And so PEER defines the power grid, whether it's the power grid that a university has, a power grid that a hospital complex could have, even an entire power grid serving a city. PEER gives guidance and best practices on how to have a reliable and resilient power grid. And certainly that's important as we're seeing climate change impacts affect the power that we receive.
Well, thank you so much for that. Let's get into some of the definitions before we go into how this fits into the space of disasters. So we hear often the terms resilient or resiliency, and sustainable. Can you go into what's the definition? Like, how does that actually play out when you're talking about sustainability in particular?
Well, when I think about sustainability, I think that the something that is good for the environment, this generation, and for future generations. And so that's why when we talk about sustainability in buildings with LEED, we're talking about the materials that go into the building. We're talking about the way you use energy, the way you use water, indoor air quality. All of those have impact on the first people who occupy the building and the long-term operation of the building. Resiliency is really the ability to withstand and then bounce back from adverse climate impacts. And the two do have some crossover, but they do have uniqueness in their own rights. And so when we talk about, for instance, rebuilding communities, when we talk about rebuilding communities, we look at a couple of things. One is site selection. Where are you building? Not only what are you building, but where are you building? I heard someone say, we've rebuilt this top road 3 times in the last 5 years. Okay, maybe that tells you something. Maybe that tells you that road shouldn't be there, or you shouldn't rebuild it the same way. So site selection is a big part of the programs. Stronger buildings is something that is important for LEED. And we've seen some communities that were affected by tornadoes where entire communities were wiped out. They rebuild back to LEED standards. We also saw in some communities, actually Superstorm Sandy, you saw a row of houses all decimated and one that was still standing up. And that was a LEED building because it was built to be, to last longer and to make a better use of resources. And the third thing is power infrastructure. Not only do you need to build on appropriate sites and build stronger, but you need robust power infrastructure. And that's what PEER is for. PEER is the LEED for power systems, we call it. And it's a framework for resilient and reliable power.
You know, before you, I had not heard that before. And this is, you know, what I do. And so I actually really love learning from people like you who have these very vastly different skill sets than I do. And I consider it a moment of privilege. And I know that you make me better at my job just from the way you're describing all of these things. Do you think for the audience, you can talk about what a building looks like when it's not resilient, not sustainable, not healthy for the people inside of it? Like we think of buildings as being inert, but they're actually not. Can you talk about that?
Well, there's always these case histories of things that didn't work. One was a nursing home where elderly people don't like drafts. And so the maintenance guy, in doing what he thought was good for the residents, he closed off all the outside air intakes. So you wouldn't get a draft from outside air coming in. The problem is that bottled up bad air. See, buildings need to breathe just like we breathe. You need to inhale and then you need to exhale. And what we exhale is loaded with carbon dioxide is one of the things, but it's also loaded with germs and bacteria. So that if there's flu in a building that's not healthy, that doesn't have good indoor air quality, you see flu recirculating around to the point where everybody gets it. Where if you have outside air coming in, if the building is able to breathe good outside air coming in, then you will see reduced impacts from flu. You will see better air quality and better health in people. And that's one of the examples I like to use. It's not always a good one, but if your building's not breathing, it's just like a person not breathing.
Well, it's actually a really good segue into one of the main vulnerabilities that buildings have in a wildfire is ember cast. And where the building breathes is often where the ember cast also finds its way into the building, especially homes with air vents, with, that aren't full vents that have not changed out. My own has not, so for the record. So can you talk about that? Like, yes, they need to breathe, but there's vulnerabilities that are built into it that need to breathe. I said breathe. I meant breathe.
There are, but it's also how and where the vents are located.
Yeah.
And you're absolutely right about ember. I mean, that's really one of the biggest issues. And when I think about embers, I think about them catching in gutters that haven't been cleaned. You have this nest egg of dry tinder, just as if you were starting a fire and an ember lands in it. And your stuff that's stuck in that gutter then catches on fire until it gets warm enough that it starts catching other things on fire. And so you want to be able to ensure that you don't have areas that provide tinder for embers. And so you can block off or prevent against embers coming in through screening and filters and other things like that. But yeah, protecting against embers is one thing. I will tell you that I've seen some people say, well, then we shouldn't build with wood. And I disagree with that. There's a fascinating new material, and certainly materials selection is a big part of protecting against wildfire. But this new material is called cross-laminate timber. And I actually have a piece of it here. And I love CLT. And if you think of it, it's wood going different directions. And these are thin pieces of wood that can come from fast growth wood. So you don't have to wait until it gets too big in diameter. But it's been in Europe for quite a few decades now. And it's an engineered wood. It has increased dimensional stability, strength, and rigidity, and fire protection. And so that's what's fascinating is that researchers have done testing on it, and they find that they char, but they char very slowly.
Oh. Instead
of smaller diameter wood, if you think of 2x4s or some of your siding, it's a much thinner wood versus this is a thicker wood. And it's fascinating how this goes together. It's like Lego. They stack it up and they screw it together with like 12 to 18 inch long screws. It comes in multiple panels, and it's been in 3 5-story buildings, residential, commercial, and it helps buildings go together faster, be more resistant against fire. It's better seismically because there's some flex in it. It's just a fascinating new kind of product that is available to give you resistance and better durability, better strength, and better resilience against fires.
So now I'm super curious because I love the field of innovation and technologies that relates to just about anything, but of course, especially wildfire. What's the cost differential of that product compared with regular, your basic 2x4s that people use now?
Well, if you think of right now, most buildings are built on site. And you can watch them go up. They do the slab, and then they do the framing, and then they fill it in, etc. CLT is all done on computer in a factory. And they build the panels, and the panels come, hook panel A to panel B to panel C, etc. So you have reduced on-site labor. You have reduced material waste. And you have a more structurally strong building. This can be your exterior. It can be your interior wall. In other words, you don't have to insulate it because it's self-insulating.
Oh, interesting.
And it goes together really fast. So I saw a whole hotel built after the foundation was in 4 weeks.
Wow. You know, what's interesting is that like with 3D printing, that there's some homes going up in Reading, I think 24 of them in a partnership with the city of Reading, where they're doing it right now, where they're printing out homes in cement, essentially. Well,
Yes.
cement is not that healthy actually of a material, but they're using a particular byproduct of it, or a product related to cement. And one of the things they say is, well, this can be up in, 48 hours or, 4 days or whatever it is, but then you still have to build out the center of it. But this is very compelling to me because I do believe that the way that we're going to make it through is through a variety, of products, a variety of ideas, and it has to match what's actually going on in that town. But I would love to see something like what you're showing us at the CLT. The more we use it, the more it will come down in cost as well. So
absolutely,
that's very exciting. Yeah.
And it also is using a material that helps the environment. So when you grow a tree, it sequesters carbon. And yes, you take it down and you make it into a construction material, but you're also then replant and you sustainably have this regenerative material versus other materials like a cement or a steel is extracted from the earth and it's not regenerative. And so when you look at materials, you want to look at them across their life cycle. Not only, initially strong, but operationally, how does it wear and tear? Is it good for the environment at the beginning, at the middle, at the end? You want to look at a lot of different characteristics.
Well, I know that one of the hardest things to watch, we had our wildfires here in Sonoma County in 2017, our biggest one. And then we've had several since then, of course, mega fires, really.
Yes.
But we didn't necessarily build back any differently than we burned down. Of course, they're more energy efficient, that's for sure. But, lumber was the primary, resource that people used. And I'm not judging them. That's not what I'm here to do. But it wasn't exactly a totally innovative rebuild at all. And I've gotten comments since then. And I always say, well, please do. We invite you to do that. One of the issues is always related to cost, though, is that you don't want to build in another systemic inequity to actually rebuilding back by mandating that material, but instead, how do we incentivize using, the capitalism, if you will, in order to bring the cost down? So, so a lot of demand hopefully will build in some cost savings for people who do want to build back, and they do want to build back better, and they want a healthier material for their families, and they want something that will last as well. So I'm excited that you brought this forth, because any ideas like that, I think, are going to help us absolutely, as we're helping new communities like in Boulder County, the Marshall Fire. There's a lot of homes that are going to be rebuilt there, about 1,200, and it would be wonderful for them to have more access to materials like that.
Absolutely. And, one of the challenges is building codes. And so
let's just jump to the building codes, please do. And then we're going to get to all the rest of the questions, but let's talk building codes.
Well, and if you think about building codes set a legal minimum standard for construction. And so for increased resiliency, many owners decide to do more. And that's where LEED and peer programs come in. They have strategies for doing more, for doing above and beyond. So when someone says, I built a code compliant building, I say, that's the worst building you can legally build. That's not
like construction grade kitchen, contractor grade. What do they call it? When you buy a home and they offer you contractor grade. Do you want that, or that's the basic?
Yeah, it's the lowest quality you can possibly build. And so going above and beyond codes, and sometimes they're called stretch codes. So one of the stretch code is the International Green Construction Code, which tells you how you can go above and beyond your basic construction code. And the IGCC has strategies that many communities adopt either partially or in whole that help them. When you say build back better, it helps them build back better because it goes beyond that legal minimum standard. And so I always like to see communities when they say, what more can I do? I point them to the IGCC. That's what more you can do. That's how you can go above and beyond your basic building code. And for wildfires, there's and I'm going to look right now, I think it's called the International Wildland Interface, Urban Wildland Interface.
We call it the WUI.
Yes.
Wildland Urban Interface. Yeah.
And
which which I'd never heard of before 2017. And I live right in the middle of it, for the record.
Well, and there was a new update to the standard 2021 that really takes into account some of the lessons learned, some of the Ember things that you've talked about. It really is a great tool for communities that want to define how to build back better. And the people in the community quite often don't have the resources to research and do it themselves, do it alone. Instead of doing it alone, some of these codes and standards, whether you adopt PEER for your power grids or LEED for your buildings, or the WUI code for your wildfire protection, or the IGCC for your construction, all of those are tools that are available to build back better.
I think one of the things that, I know that one of the things that we run into often, and I don't expect you to have a perfect answer for this, but I have to bring this point into the podcast is, it's more expensive to do. It just is. And for now it is. And I keep mentioning that because we deal with a lot of wildfire survivors who've lost everything. When they look at their insurance, they're dramatically underinsured, which means they're also often using their contents. And even then they might have to take out a second mortgage. That there's a lot of the, when we sit down with our insurance and we look at it, we think about like, well, how much would I sell my home for? Well, how much you would sell your home for is not necessarily at all what it would cost to rebuild it. And so it's something we run into in these fire affected communities all the time, is the dramatic a number of people who are underinsured. And so does building back with LEED certification, does that help your insurance? Does it affect it whatsoever? Or is that outside of your scope?
It's a little outside of my scope, but I have heard that there are insurance agencies that are looking at this. They're looking at the LEED for Cities program to reduce the insurance costs that the city may have, and the increase your bond ratings, which is another thing that cities are looking at. There have been some of these IGCC codes or other codes and standards that when you report them to the insurance company, give you insurance discounts. So there is that, but should we have to wait for a disaster to do what we know is right to do? We have the tools to know what right looks like. We have the tools to know what resilient looks like. And so if you're choosing to live at the edge of a wildland, if you're choosing to live in an area that has tornadoes, if you're choosing to live in an area subject to hurricanes, then you need to have a building that can withstand the risks that you're going to be subject to. We shouldn't have to wait for a Superstorm Sandy to say, oops, guess we should have done it right to begin with, because the cost of building back is higher than the cost of doing it right in the beginning.
I think one of the things that we're hoping for is like a sweet spot, like where, yes, it's true that there are people who, choose to live, on the edge or inside of the WUI or on the edge of the forest. And of course, we see that all the time. There's a lot of vacation homes, second homes often live, are often in recreation-based areas, which are often in the woods. But they also live alongside people who've been there for many generations and often don't even have mortgages, because it's multi-generational, but at the same time, these are not people who are wealthy. These are people who maybe are getting by on $25,000 a year, and they're doing fine because they don't have a mortgage. We saw that in like the Caldor fire, there are 70% of the people whose homes burned down are uninsured, not under, but uninsured because they couldn't afford the insurance. I would hope that the insurance industry would start to look at how can we actually, work with LEED, work with I'm going to see if I can get it right for the first time, GBCI,
Yes.
to see, that took me like 7 times. To find an incentive way for people who already have homes that are already in the WUI that are attached to the land as well. How do we make them more resilient in a way that's also cost effective and ultimately might save the insurance industry money on the back end? I feel like there has to be a layer of some kind of Venn diagram where we can find a sweet spot where they can use all of the wonderful knowledge that you bring to the table with the reality of why a lot of people live in the WUI, which has to do with there's naturally occurring affordable housing in the WUI everywhere.
There is, and some of this has to do with operation and maintenance. It's not all about new construction. And so if you have an existing building like we talked about, clean your gutters. That's a simple start. Clear the area around the building from brush, from overhanging trees and branches. You can reduce the opportunity for the fire or the embers to grab hold. And there's a lot of information out there on how to increase the resilience of your existing buildings and properties. So it's not all about new construction. We always like to think new construction's easy, but how you maintain and operate your existing buildings is important.
That is so true. And before we actually turn to some of our other bigger questions about disaster, I do want to note that if you can't afford, $5,000 for Vulcan vents for your home, what you can do is you can actually fashion something that you could put up that's temporary red alert for wildfire. Sorry, I have a little bit of a allergy thing going on today. Makes me a little bit stupid, but there are things that you can fashion and things that are very analog and not expensive, but you're absolutely correct. But whenever possible and however possible, it'd be good to have our next generation of homes really follow along the standards that you're talking to, as well as our energy grids, because clearly energy and how we deliver energy is definitely contributing to the rate at which we're burning down. So one of the things I'd like to do is quickly take a commercial break to listen to our sponsors, and we will be right back with Katherine Hammack. Thank you.
Fannie Mae provides mortgage options for you and your family. If you have a mortgage owned by Fannie Mae, you may have financial options available after a disaster, such as forbearance plans, deferral of payments, lending assistance, and counseling. Find out more from our Disaster Response Network. Go online at www.knowyouroptions.com/relief or call 1-877-833-1746 today.
And we are back. Thank you so much for joining us. Once again, my guest on the How to Disaster podcast is Katherine Hammack. And our next question is that talk to us about how your programs like LEED and PEER play a role in rebuilding communities after a disaster.
And we hate to say that you have to have a disaster to build right. And you and I were just talking about that. The 3 main things I mentioned before: site selection. Really take a hard look at the site. Should you be rebuilding back in the same site in exactly the same manner? I mean, you need to assess things like dealing with rainwater. Is the hydrology appropriate for building back? Or were you just flooded out and it washed everything away? And if that's going to be the way of the future, maybe there's a different way to build. The vegetation, the soils, the assessment of the site should take into account all of those things to determine where to build and should you build back in the same site in the same way. We talked about stronger buildings, and what's fascinating to me is to look at some of these older buildings. The oldest building in the United States with LEED certification was built in 1807.
Wow.
And it's gone through many renovations since. It started as a private residence, one of those really monstrosity ones, but it served as the first permanent building for Radcliffe College. And it was one of those early education institutions for women as part of the historic Seven Sisters colleges in the Northeast. So think about how buildings were built back then. We built with thermal mass, we built with stone, we built with thick wood. We built them to last without electricity, so because you didn't have electricity. So some of those durability kind of things are really coming back, I will say, in fashion, because people are recognizing it's called passive house. And passive house, where you can build something that does not need electricity to operate. And so it operates passively to provide you the comfort that you need in all seasons. So stronger buildings is something. And then we talked about the power infrastructure. On my own house, I have solar on the roof and battery storage and an electric vehicle. And when I generate more electricity than I need, I bank it on the power grid. And when I have an overcast day, like today's a little overcast, I withdraw that power and use it. And so I've made enough energy to essentially operate for a year on energy that I have produced or produced and banked. And so when you think about your power infrastructure, that also helps you in disasters. Whether you're talking about an individual house or even a community, microgrids are something we're seeing. And I'm fascinated with microgrids because a microgrid has both power generation, power distribution, and quite often energy storage there on site. So it can connect and disconnect from the main power grid. The main power grid goes down, it can still operate and provide power to critical resources.
Now, it might surprise you, but there's definitely people who will be in our audience who don't actually know how the power is getting to them now. Can you, do you want to talk at all about how that our power grid is actually very 19th century in many ways, or early 20th century?
And when I talk about power grids, I like to talk about nanogrids. Nanogrids are like when you carry a battery with you to recharge your cell phone. That's a nanogrid. You're your own power grid. A microgrid is the solar on my roof and my energy storage, or sometimes they're called mini grids. But when you get to one of these large microgrids, that's a community where the power is produced. Maybe it's a large solar system or a wind farm, or even some natural gas generation that generates power and can separate from the main power grid. One of the challenges with the main power grid is you have power produced at a central location, and quite often it's due to a combustion process through whether it's coal or natural gas. And then power is generated there, and then it's delivered over transmission lines and then distribution lines many, many miles. And I like to think of two different kinds of power grids. One of them I think of as a spider, where you've got your power generation in the middle and your power lines go out in a radial fashion. So if you're at the very end of the power grid and anything happens upstream, you're out of power. A microgrid quite often is a series of loops so that you can be fed from two different directions, maybe two different power plants even. So if something goes down, they reroute the power and isolate that segment that has gone down. So a lot of people are still able to have power. So I think the future of utilities is a series of networked microgrids that connect and disconnect. And we're seeing this popping up around the world. We're seeing it a lot of in California. where there's a lot of talk about microgrids, and several of them have been functioning really well.
You know, we love a microgrid here, the idea of it, because starting, you know, about 3 years ago, we started having public safety power shutoffs. And so I remember the first year that they instituted them, we lost power for days 6 times. And what the longest was also 6 days. And so it's easy to remember, but the minimum was 48 hours, you know, up to 6 days. And, you know, you're feeling pretty good. Like you can totally do the group project, but about day 3, it starts to get a little cranky. And it was amazing to me how many people learned, you know, at that time, how a power grid even works, or the fact they'd be like, why are they turning off my power when it's when there's barely any wind on the valley floor? I live in a valley, I live in Sonoma Valley, but up on the hills where their power is actually coming from, there are 90-mile-an-hour winds. But if they can't see it or feel it, it was very frustrating for a lot of people. And it definitely wasn't resilient, and certainly wasn't sustainable. And so I'm looking forward to having more microgrids. There's also the added bonus too of, like, with what you're doing with your solar, with your nano grid. I've not heard that before, so I'm going to adopt that from here on out. So thank you so much for that. But you're also, you know, we have such a dependence on fossil fuels, and clearly we have to move away from that. There's no question. I mean, some people want to stay in the 1800s. I just happen not to be one of them. But you are not only producing your own energy through a renewable resource, but you're also making sure that your car is not running on the same fossil fuels. So I just want to...
Right. And I have a plug-in electric vehicle, so I run my car off of solar too. But, you know, when you generate your own power, you have to think about using your appliances that use a lot of energy at the time you're producing the most power. So a lot of times your utility rates will tell you cheap power is after 9 o'clock at night, and expensive power is in the middle of the day. Yet if I'm generating my energy from solar, I have lots of power during the day.
Right.
So that's when I want to run my dishwasher and my clothes washer and dryer and my heavy use appliances. Whereas at night, I want to minimize my use of electricity because I'm then living off my battery. And so I've got a battery storage in the garage. And so I can run things still, but I try to really minimize it. So you change your habits to accommodate the power. And the other thing to think about, you know, I said a lot of our power comes from coal. Still in the United States, it's about 30%. We're over 40% natural gas. We're about 10% nuclear, and the balance is a combination of hydro and utility. And those are very rough numbers, but hydro and renewable energy. So when you think about your power, the dirtiest power is at night, because that's when your coal plants are running. During the day, that's when you've got a lot of your solar and your natural gas, and they call them natural gas peaking plants, but that's still fossil fuel. So you sort of want to run your appliances, and we're working with a lot of utilities on how to decarbonize the power grid and how to decarbonize the environment, especially the building sector, because we're very concerned about climate change.
I think one of the hard things in the space of climate change is that we viewed it as such a long game for so long. And until we've had so many recurrent and frequent natural disasters, which we now are seeing, you know, off season. I mean, the fact that last night New Orleans had 2 tornadoes in March is totally bizarre. You know, that we're attending a wildfire that erupted in Boulder County in Colorado, the Marshall Fire on December 30th. Like, these are not naturally occurring seasonal things anymore. We're all vulnerable all the time. So all of a sudden, what felt like more of a long game no longer feels that way. So I am somewhat hopeful that we will make much faster change. Do you see a faster change on the horizon, or do you think people will continue sort of in the same vein?
You know, the question is what motivates people to do something different?
Yeah.
And we are quite often motivated financially. And like you said earlier, how can you get people to build back better? Are there grants? Are there loans? Are there incentive structures? And certainly with some of the new policies that we're seeing coming out of Congress, there is money to build back a better power grid. And a better power grid quite often has undergrounded cables, so they're not subject to wind or fire or some of those challenges, but it's expensive. It's about $1 million a mile to bury a power grid. And you have to have the land rights to do so. So it can be costly, it can be expensive, but it's also, what are we doing? What are our personal habits? I think individuals can make a difference. How and when are you using energy? I have no lights on in my house right now. Yes, I'm using my computer, but I have no lights on because there's enough light coming in from outside. And so think about the things you do. It's like, you know, it's like your mom said, you know, don't leave the door open, and don't stand in front of the refrigerator with it open. Common sense kinds of things. LED lights, turning off your lights when you leave a room. All of these things add up. They add up personally to your finances, but they benefit the community and the environment as a whole. And yes, I put on solar, but I also chose a house that had a south-facing roof, south-sloping roof, so it made it easier to add solar. And so I think we can all do our part, even little contributions. You know, someone was talking about driving and grouping your errands together. You know, don't make 5 trips a day, make 1 trip a day and make 3 stops on that trip. You know, just sort of think through your habits and what you can do. Cleaning your gutters is a simple thing, trimming your bushes outside against wildfire if that's your threat. But know your threats. Know your threats, know your risks, and then adapt to them and design in what you can.
I think so. I just really want to put a pin in the word adapt. Like this time does require that all of us adapt, and that we also take some personal responsibility in how to be, you know, safer, and how to, you know, keep our neighborhoods and our communities safer, and take some responsibility. I was on a call earlier today where one of the things we were talking about is how important it is to make sure that you have enough to sustain your household between 3 and 7 days, because you can't expect the government just to come in and, you know, to take care of you for those period of time, especially when we have so many disasters occurring so often. There is no magical cavalry out there. That does not exist. You know, we are responsible. Can you talk to us a little bit about how your work has maybe changed over the past 4 to 5 years since the advent of this era of megafire?
I think one of the things that has changed is really that focus on materials. What are you doing in construction? But then I had a call the other day looking at landscaping, and that landscaping is changing because the plants that you are used to seeing are not surviving the climate change. If your plant is not surviving, then it's dying, and then it's getting dry and brittle, and it becomes fuel for the fire. So we need to think about changing our landscaping, changing the materials we use, and building more with more resilient materials. That's why, and again, I don't work for these guys. I'm intrigued that someone came up with this idea, because if you think of it, when you cross materials together, they get stronger. And you take weak materials, you put them together to make them stronger. And now you have better resilience against earthquake. You have better resilience against fire. You have less materials in construction. And then you have less waste because you can do it at a factory. And so I think we're also seeing some of these factory built construction projects. And I'm seeing this in commercial construction too, where they build segments or huge portions in a factory, and then they erect them on site. And that reduces costs, but also in a factory, you're able to put in the better insulation, use stronger materials, and increase your resiliency that way. So I guess that's what we're seeing is the materials, the construction styles, and the landscaping that's really changing as we're having to adapt to the increasing number of disasters that we're seeing.
That is, that's such good information, but it's also just good for our audience to hear that there are great minds and hearts actually working on this problem, working to get us to the other side. We are not just at the mercy of what's happening to us. You know, we can actually adapt and change and be more sustainable and be more resilient, especially as we define exactly what that means. And that's one of the things that I liked at the outset of this podcast is that you gave a specific example of what those terms actually mean, because they are used so often, but really part of that is about you do have agency in your own resiliency and your own sustainability. And if and we know that the ongoing problem of cost is that's not going to change. What we can do is actually look at it realistically and figure out how to bring the cost down. And the more of us that take part in that, then the more those costs come down naturally. That's just basic capitalism 101. Is there anything that you wish I would have asked you on this podcast that I haven't gotten to yet? Because your knowledge base is so wide that I could go on for hours, but we don't have hours.
Really the level of preparation for natural disasters is fundamentally a personal decision or a business decision. It's an owner's decision. We see some of these lessons learned from disasters like Superstorm Sandy that still aren't widely implemented. One of the lessons learned was if you're in an area that's susceptible to flooding, don't have your mechanical system in a sub-basement.
Oh, never heard that before. That's
elevate your equipment. And even just like in a commercial building, put your equipment on the second floor, not the first floor, not the ground floor, not the sub-basement. Elevate your mechanical equipment because then it's going to survive a flood and you won't have to replace it. And frankly, doing that when you're building a building or renovating a building is an easy thing to do. Another thing was quick connects, which was surprising, but if your building loses power and you don't have backup power and you want to bring in a generator, how can you plug that generator into the building? Well, you can design that in really easily. Even for a house, you can design that in at the beginning. But if it's an emergency situation and you now need a generator in an emergency situation, you essentially have to rip out the electrical panel to hardwire in your generator. Whereas a quick connect would allow you to plug it in. And that was one of the lessons learned, is that they couldn't plug in the generators. They brought a generator to a site, and now you need an electrician to go through and figure out how to redo the wiring. Flood barriers. Even temporary sidewalk barriers can protect against floods. And then the sewage backflow valves. So sewage valves are valves that prevent sewage backflow into basements during rainflow and floods. It's just a backflow valve, simple valve to put in. But if the sewage system backs up because there's a lot of rainwater and you don't have one, then you're going to have your building flooded with sewage, and then that's a pain to clean up. So some of these are very simple kinds of things to do that you can budget for or do, I will say, at your leisure in preparation for a flood. But it's a business decision. It's a risk analysis. And I think each of us need to do that personally, whether it's keeping 7 days of food on hand to make sure that you can feed yourself, or business-wise, what do you need to keep your business operating? If you were to lose power, if there were to be a flood, how can you maintain your business operations? How can gas stations continue to pump gas? Or how can you recharge your electric vehicle if the power system goes down? There's a lot of these things that you need to do that risk analysis and really think through where you're vulnerable and what you can do now. And doing it now at your leisure is much better than doing it at haste during an emergency.
I think that those are great points, because, you know, something that is simple to do ahead of time, if you're trying to find a plumber or trying to find an electrician or trying to find that person in the midst of a disaster, so everyone else is too. And, you know, just a supply and demand, you're not likely to have it, and it becomes so much more complicated. So I really appreciate that. It's kind of like a seatbelt before versus a seatbelt after.
Right.
You know, I really appreciate that. Can you please tell our audience where they can find out more and where they can find you?
Certainly, if you want information on the PEER system for power grids, for resilient and reliable power grids, it's PEER at gbci.org. Or if you're interested in LEED, L-E-E-D, you can just punch LEED into your search engine and you will come up with more resources than you ever imagined.
Well, I just really want to thank you for bringing this, you know, bringing all your knowledge and your experience to this podcast, because, you know, we are called How to Disaster, but in our perfect world, we wouldn't get to the point of disaster. And so this would be like how to prepare so that a disaster isn't so terrible, so impactful. And I'm so glad that people like you have their minds and hearts that are totally leaning into the before the fire issue, before the flood, because that's really how we're all going to make it through. So thank you again, Katherine, for being on the podcast. Thank you.
My pleasure. Thank you.
All right. Thank you for joining us on the podcast, How to Disaster. For more information, please visit our website at afterthefireusa.org. And if you liked this video, please hit subscribe.